This video is a walkthrough of CSE Activity 122, the Hack Attack activity. I'm going to walk through the use of the API and the starter app and the task that's going to be the goal of the lesson. The beginning part of the activity walks through the information about the API, the Application Programming Interface, and how it works, and how to set it up and test it with the website hurl.it, and the different things that can be done with the interface. I'm going to demonstrate those, but please refer to the activity documentation to understand the different syntaxes you have to use. You can use the website hurl.it to test and set up an account to work with this API. The first thing you do is you use a post method to the website https://cs-api.pltw.org/new-user/ whatever the name of the user you want it to be. Note that several places in the activity document the images show ics.api. It should be cs-api. I'm not going to actually send this post message because I already have this new user created, but you'd click on the I'm a robot to the reCAPTCHA and then launch that request to create that, and it'll give you output at the bottom that says a new user has been created, a new endpoint has been created. To post data to this endpoint, you can remove the word new user and the slash, and then at the end of the name of the account, you enter in the parameter text, and then behind the equal sign, you put whatever text you want to add. First entry. And now I can launch this request. And the output at the bottom should tell me there are now 1 strings stored. Now if I want to do a different entry, such as second entry, I can click on the reCAPTCHA again and send that request. And it now tells me there are 2 strings stored. To be able to tell which strings have been stored, instead of running a post, we run a GET request. No parameters are needed, so we'll delete that and simply run acknowledge the reCAPTCHA and launch the request. And we can see now first entry and second entry are both displayed. Part of the functionality of this is it allows you to vote or add incremented values to each of the entries. The syntax for that is make a post request, and after sample CSE, the word increment, and then the parameter ID equals and whichever value you want to increment. So if it's the first one I want to increment, I just do ID 1 and launch that request. It tells me now the count for that item is at 1. If I would want to vote for number 2, I can do number 2, acknowledge that the reCAPTCHA and launch that request. And now the count for that item is also at 1. If I do it back to number 1 again, and here's something to note. Eventually when you're using hurl.it, you will have to start acknowledging in a more sophisticated way that you're not a bot trying to use their website too much. So you'll get pictures like this that you have to choose things like what are the images that match the label shelf. So I just click on the ones that seem to have a shelf in them and I press verify. If it agrees, then it'll allow me to launch the request. Now there's 2 items for that. And now I can verify all the things that are in there by doing a GET request, again removing everything for parameters and launching that. It's going to ask you likely to acknowledge your non-botness multiple times after you get to that point. But then it does output that I have my 2 entries and then I have the incremented values. Finally, to reset everything that's in there, you need to use the switch reset and then the parameter password equals. And the thing that we didn't see happen because I did it before I started recording was when you set up a new account, it will display a password for you, which will be a 3 or 4 digit number. You want to make sure you know that password. So mine was 659. So now when I put 659 in as the known password and I run the post request with reset password, get past the CAPTCHA here, if the correct password was entered, it'll say that the data for the endpoint sample CSE or whatever the account was has been cleared. So that's how you can use the API through hurl.it. But now we'll look at the app itself and find out how that has been programmed to run through the code for us. All right, we'll start actually with the designer here. And the designer will show us all of the different components that are in it. At the top of the designer, we have a text box and a button, use this API endpoint. That's to be used for putting in the username of the account when you start using the application. There's the get items button, which will do the get request to find out what was stored in the account in the database. There's the post item, which allows you to add more items to it. The vote for item, which allows you to choose a value and increment it. The reset button, which allows you to put in the password and clear the data. And then a couple of more components that are used for the later part of the activity. A hack button, a password guest label, and a place for the guest password. At the bottom is a label response API and then a API response value. It's pretty much invisible because there's no text in it, but we can see over here on the side that it's just a text label that will be populated as the program runs. There are 5 non-visible components, and they're all web components. You can see in the connectivity panel palette, web is a component, and 5 different copies of that non-visible component have been added to be used for making post and get requests in the run of the app. In the blocks view, the blocks over here that start with this global variable are the basic functions of the app. So a global variable is initialized called global API. It's initialized with storage space for API URL text, but that's going to be replaced right away, and that's just it's just starter text to explain what the purpose of that variable is. But that's where the API URL is going to be stored to be used throughout the app. And that's done right away in this next block. When the username set button is clicked, it'll take whatever was in that username input text to the left of it, and then it'll set that global API to be the beginning of that URL, cs-api.pl2w.org, and then whatever username was set. Then the get strings button is the button that can be pressed to just retrieve the strings from whatever is in the account. So it does that by setting, first of all, the URL of one of those web components that's called get URL to whatever the global API is. And remember, when running the get request, you don't need any other parameters. It's just the name of the user account attached to the URL. Then it sets that API response value, which was that hidden text sort of at the bottom of the screen. It sets that to the value getting users data, just to show that something is happening. And then it calls the function getURL.get, which is built in for the web component, which makes the get request, just like we use with hurl.it. Now, once that get request has been made, if it successfully reaches a server and gets a response, then this handler will run, this when you get URL.got text. So if it gets a response from the server, It will then run this piece of code. And there are several variables that it'll grab from that response when it runs. The URL, the response code, the response type, and the response content. And for all of the different parts of this app, it's really the response content that we're interested in. It's going to set then that API response value, which is the text at the bottom of the screen, to be the response content. And notice it uses this special block called getURL JSON text decode. And this block uses some scripting to take the JSON text, which is the JavaScript object notation, which is the text that's being received back from the server, and just formatting it in a way that can be successfully displayed in the text label. The next button down the screen is the post string button, which allows you to post new strings to the code, to the API. And it does, the first thing it does is it sets the post URL web component's URL to the text, whatever the API is, whatever the URL for the API is, plus that parameter question mark text equals, and then whatever was put in the box right next to this button, the post string. Once it does that, it sets that response value at the bottom to posting new item to show that something is happening. And then it calls this time a post.text method instead of a get one, which is what was used before. And it takes whatever that URL is and places it and sends it to that server, to that API. Now note here that there's a text box or a text option that says unused text within post request. This is just garbage text. It's not used in this implementation, but it just the App Inventor block needs a value there. So this is just descriptive text to show it's not being used is put in there. It really could be any text and it wouldn't make a difference. Finally, it sets the post string input.text to clear, which is the box where you put whatever you want to post in it, to an empty value, just so it shows it is ready for the next thing. I have this extra block here that I'm going to come back and talk about in a little bit when we're demonstrating the app, but I'll talk about what this block would be used for. All right, once that text is posted, just like the get, when the response comes back, it's going to do something with that. In this case, when it does the post, it'll get a response back, and it'll just say how many strings have been posted. And that's what the text is here that's going to be populated at the bottom. The next block is the vote button and the vote block, or the vote text entry. So you can put in a number value and then click the vote button. And it does another post request, but it does something very similar to what the post did, the post text did. It sets the URL by joining the global API. This time it uses the switch increment and question mark ID equals to put the right values in there, and it puts in the vote index value, which is from the text box right next to it. It sets the API response value at the bottom to something to show something's happened. Or happening. I changed it to voting for item. The original sample code says post. It says the same thing as the post is posting new item. I think that was just a copy paste error. So I changed it to be more accurate, voting for item. Then it runs the call of the vote URL.postText, which is the same type of call that was been used before. And again, it's got this extra text here just because it needs to be able to fill that space with something, but it's unused. And it again sets the input box, the text box, to no values to clear it out. When the vote URL post method gets sent, it waits for a response, and when it gets one, it runs the got text, what happens when it gets a response. And again, it's just using the response content block, and it's setting the API response value at the bottom of the screen to whatever the response content is. The next section is the password reset. If you know the password, then you can use the known password reset, which is right below the vote item. There's the reset box. And what that does is, just like the other posts, it concatenates the values needed for the URL. So it takes, and for the reset URL, it sets the global API plus the extra text /reset $password equals, and then whatever the password that has been entered into the text box there. Then it sets the information screen at the bottom, the API response value to reset and process. It calls that post method, again using some garbage text to fill in the space, but then it clears the password box just like the other two cleared their other boxes. And finally, when that URL successfully connects to the API and gets a response, it sets the response text at the bottom to the response content. And again, it needs the JSON text decode method to properly display what the information is that it gets back. Now let's show how that works. I'm going to switch over to my phone, which is connected here, and we can see how that works through. So the first thing to do is to put in the name of the account, which I've already entered there. It's also very important that you click the Use this API endpoint, because remember, that's what creates that global variable, which is used by all those other buttons, and takes the cs-api.pltw.org and concatenates it with the username. Then the get items allows me to run that and get whatever value has been stored. Now note at the bottom it says that there's no strings and no values because I had cleared those values when I was using hurl.it. But I can post new values. So if I put in something new, like first, let's see if I can spell first right. And when I now post items, it should, if it successfully posts it, tells me that there's now a string stored. And if I do another one, it now says there's 2 strings stored. And I can see which strings have been stored by running the get items. And it shows me that first and second have been stored. Now, something interesting that I've learned is that if we would give a 2-word input in the app, like third post, and try to post that, it's not going to give any response. And if I do a get items, it shows that it did not actually take it. And the reason for that is because if there's a space or some other characters in that post within the app, it's not going to properly send that value to the API because the URL does not accept spaces, standard spaces correctly. So we can fix that by asking the program to properly format whatever text we have in there. So that brings me back to the app and that extra block that I had hovering over here. So this block is found in the web component URI, the web component drawers. So for the post URL, it's the block that says call post URL.URI encode text. And if I put this block between the join block and the post string input.text, exactly like the way the JSON text decode block was used, this will encode the text properly to be passed as through the URL to the API. So now if I go back to the app and I try to put in another item, but this time one again that has spaces, and I post it, and now successfully takes it. And if I get items, I can see that that entered in properly. So that piece of text is a good thing to add, that block, excuse me, is a good thing to add to allow you to be able to post multiple words. Now I can do the vote for items just like we did on the hurl.it. So I can choose to vote for item number 1. It tells me that it's counted as that 1. I could choose to vote for item number 3. That count as that 1. And if I run get items, we can see that the first and the third values now have 1 vote each. Finally, I can do the reset for it with my known password. And once again, I know my password to be 659 because I recorded that when I created it. So I'll enter 659. And now when I do the reset, it says, it doesn't say fully what has been done, but if I go through get items, it'll show me that there now values have been cleared. Okay. That's the basic functionality of the app. And now let's look at what you're supposed to extend the app to be able to do. So the next part is using the hacking feature of the app. And that's where the attempt data reset button and the guesses for the password will come into play. Now, if I just try to click it right away, we'll see that I get an error. Actually, I have to change something. I was trying it before. This code will look like this to start. It'll simply have hack button try password. And now I'm going to try that again. And we'll see. All right, so when we try this now, and I'm going to go back to the app, and we try to attempt the data reset, it gives this error 1109, the specified URL is not valid. And we'll see why that is in a moment. This text is these blocks are not in there yet, so we're just gonna hide these for now, and we'll come back and look at those in a minute. But these are blocks that are already in the starter app. So we have an initialized global min password and max password. They start both at set at 0. Then we have a button that is that hack button, that attempt data reset button that runs a procedure try password. We'll jump down to that try password procedure, which is right here. And what that does is it calls the hack URL web component post text. And again, it's using that unused text within post, which is just basically garbage text. But it tries to send a post request. If it successfully sends a post request and gets a response, it'll do this next thing. But what's happening right now is it's not getting a response because at the start, there is nothing that specifies what the URL should be for the hack URL web component. So what we can do to find out what's going to happen is this block here is basically a copy of the block from the reset block. So here's the reset block, set reset URL password to those values, but it's just modified a little bit. It's still using the global API, it's using the correct text here, and then it's putting in a value for a password. Right now it's just 0. So if I place this above the call password or try password in the hack button, and now I try it again, it will allow me to do a successful reset request attempt, but it says error at the bottom. And the reason it says error is because that's part of the text it gets back from the URL hack. It sets it when it gets text back from that post request, it decodes it and it says the response content was error. And if we jump back to Hurlet and we try the same thing, we change this password to a known non-write password, go through the CAPTCHA hoop again, and launch the request. We see that the first thing that's returned is error instead of that the data was cleared. So the task now is to modify this code so that when I click on the hack button, it will guess different things to be used for the password. And it also needs to be coded so that it will sense whether or not it has guessed the right thing, depending on the response that's being received back from the API. So that's the task for you to proceed with in activity 122.